The system tells me this is recording, so we're going to go ahead and dive right into this. We're looking at arguably one of the two greatest treatises on time ever written, and this is the first great treatise on time. Aristotle's contribution to the philosophy of time is seminal, and you can go to the internet and find a copy of Aristotle's Physics in some form or another, hopefully a PDF, get it for free, and look up his section on time. And once you locate it, you can go ahead and read it. St. Augustine was a figure of the 4th and the 5th century AD. If Plato and Aristotle are, as it were, the great intellects of the period prior to the birth of Jesus Christ, if you like, the major intellect, I mean, there were several, but the major intellect, by most accounts, during the first millennium following the birth of Jesus Christ is St. Augustine. Now, there are a number of other very, very great intellects, but if you had to pick one, and you shouldn't have to be forced to pick one, but let's say someone was unjust and forced you to pick one, St. Augustine would, by probably the majority of accounts, be it. I mean, amongst students of Western civilization, Western philosophy, Western theology, and the like. And we're going to go ahead and look at St. Augustine's great treatment of time. Reading it, one wonders what took so long. I mean, this is about a 20-page treatment. It's not a long treatise, but it's a genuine treatise. And he's tackling a genuinely fascinating, almost hypnotizing metaphysical problem. What is time? And you might even begin by reflecting on the temporal process you are experiencing right now and listening to my voice on recording, stimulating thoughts. Well, surely having an effect on your hearing apparatus, which itself excites certain thoughts in a sequence. And these appear in the present, they disappear into the past and are replaced by new thoughts which arrive from the future. And what is this temporal process? What is this, if you like, temporalizing, right, of your consciousness such that you can have this sequence of experience? Sequence of experiences. Can we nail this down somehow with a philosophical definition in the way perhaps that Aristotle perhaps nailed down the definition of change? Not the same thing as time, right? As an entechia of a having of the end of thing in potentiality as in potentiality. So I'm not going to comment on that again. But by the way, there is no other definition of change in the history of philosophy. Isn't that interesting? Okay. I mean, there is no, let me be careful. There is no general definition of change that embraces both local change from place to place and qualitative change, say from being a certain shade to a darker or a lighter shade. Okay. And quantitative change in terms of growth. Aristotle thought he captured all three sorts of change in one definition. He set those against generation. Generation is the instantaneous coming to be. Well, I shouldn't say that. The instantaneous passage into being from non-being of an entity. For example, the moment at which an instance of a species is conceived in the womb of a female instance of that species. Okay? Or is conceived in a watery environment, if we're looking at like a fish egg or something like that. So if you're interested in that, because I'm getting some interesting commentary from you folks in your journals, you can look at Aristotle's treatise on the generation of animals. Okay? He talks about that there, on the generation of animals. And book 1 would be of particular interest to you. Okay, and maybe you're appreciating the fact that, it's not obvious that Aristotle has been refuted on any of these points. He's sort of alive and well, and that would have it might come to you as a surprise, given what you were taught in high school. Maybe you took high school physics, and the idea that Aristotle might actually be saying things which are true, right? Despite the fact of the progress of the predictive power of physics, massive progress in that respect. Um, it might have surprised you, and maybe it's excited you, and now you wish to, hold on to what you've learned about modern physics, but also supplement that with a study of Aristotle and see if you can work out some kind of compatibility of understanding. Okay, so let's get back to St. Augustine here. So we're going to look at his Confessions. So we'll have to talk about the nature of that book. We're going to confine our attention to book 11. I used to teach most of the book, or even the whole book sometimes. And maybe I'll do that again sometime. So this is a short treatise. Book 11 is a short treatise in Christian metaphysics. And then there's a question, the background question here is Christianity true or not? If it were a course in philosophy of religion, we could assign some special attention to that. It's not, so I'm not going to assign special attention to it. But if you're interested, one of the arguments or one of the sites where people argue back and forth about this is that of miracles. And so if Christianity is true, then God has sent miracles. It's one of the doctrines of Christianity, that God sends miracles in order to confirm the truth of the Christian faith, right? And so if you're interested, you could pursue that matter on your own time. So what I would recommend, I mean, there are many ways to do this, but one go-to site would be to look at the Lord's Medical Bureau. It's a group of medical doctors. Some of them are atheist or agnostic. Others are Catholic. Others are Protestant. I think they probably have a Muslim there. So, to avoid bias. And then there are people who go to the City of Lords, and then they bathe in the waters, which are supposed to be healing, and they were promised to be healing, according to Catholic tradition, by St. Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ. And they claim that a number of these people have actually been healed of very horrible conditions, like advanced lupus and stuff like that. They bathe in the water and it goes away within 2 minutes or 2 hours or something to that effect. Okay, you be the judge of that. You can look that up. And there's one famous case, a man named Alexis Carroll, who was, I think, an agnostic, and then he brought one of his patients, and that person was healed. And so he became a convert. I think after, it's an emotional process with this stuff. So I think after a decent period, he managed to reconcile himself to what he regarded as the truth, and he thought, Christianity, in that case, Catholic Christianity, is true, and he converted. So that's for you to pursue on your own time. And I know 40% of Rhode Island is Catholic, another big chunk is Protestant, so it's sort of an active area of concern for a lot of people. So if it's a really active area of concern for you, you're kind of wrestling with it, take a philosophy of religion course sometime. If you get a good philosopher who handles that in a sympathetic way, that can help you. All right, so now let's talk about what a confession is. Okay, it comes from the Latin confessio. And in the Latin, this means admission or agreement, right? So when you make a confession, you're admitting something or you're agreeing to something. In this case, we're talking about a bishop, okay, a person who became a bishop. He was forced to become a bishop, incidentally. And the Bishop of Hippo, Hippo, in Northern Africa. Northern Africa used to not be a Muslim stronghold. It used to be a Christian stronghold, but that was obviously changed with the Muslim conquest. And what are you agreeing with? Agreeing, well, God, you're right in the final analysis. And we have to spell out what that means. That would involve a few different elements here. First, that God is indeed perfect. And I should say not merely perfect. I mean, this is sort of an understatement here. Infinitely perfect. It has all the perfections. God is truth, beauty, goodness. He is light, life, joy, glory, and holiness, and other things too. Okay? All those things. And one admits that in this act of confession. So that's what's going on in this treaty. So you have to have this background knowledge in order to understand what's actually happening. And I'll give you these some of the attributes here. And he's perfect love. John 4, 7, 8. Okay, 2 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. God is love, period. Okay. Number 2, one is admitting that one is a wretched sinner, unfit at present at least to dwell in community with God. Okay, or in a community with God. And that sounds rather pessimistic. So The idea is that an individual is only able to participate in goodness insofar as he or she draws, um, as it were, energy from the source of all goodness, and that would be God. It's very much like Plato. Plato had this idea of the good that we looked at, right? And insofar as you do anything good, that has to be um, in virtue of some kind of positive relationship you've established between yourself and the idea of the good. That's Plato. And St. Augustine, he was a kind of Platonist, by the way. He was a Christian Neoplatonist. That's how we describe him. So what happens is in the transition from Neoplatonism to Christian Neoplatonism is that Neoplatonism is what we have called atheistic supernaturalism. Christian Neoplatonism drops the A. It becomes theistic supernaturalism. And Augustine thinks he can demonstrate that that doctrine is true while actually learning from Plato and the people who followed Plato, like Plotinus and Porphyry and people like that. Okay, so very good. So they have a kind of spiritual exercise for demonstrating one's a wretched sinner, and that is try to remember the very worst thing you've ever done. Okay, that's your actual value because that proves how low you can sink. You say, well, how about the best thing I've ever done? Truly, you should also remember that that's what you're capable of doing when cooperating with God's grace, and God gives that grace, according to this doctrine at least, to all, one way or another, and there are different species of that, and that gets into theology, all right? But the Platonists and the Christians agree on this. You have to rely upon the idea of the good, if you like, which is either a non-person for the Platonists or a person for the Christians. Okay, so anyway, confession contains the following aspects. This is just setting up our analysis. It's an act of praising God, okay, clearly. It's also an act of repenting for one's sin, reflecting point 2 above. It's an act of resolving not to repeat the sin. It's an expression of willingness to do reparation for one's sin, that is to undergo some kind of purificatory or even purgatorial process here on this earth for the sake of enacting justice. One has done something wrong. Well, we think the person should suffer proportionately. Okay, that's why we put people in prison, correct? And then finally, a request for forgiveness and grace. Forgiveness will be part of that grace, right? And in particular, for spiritual perfection. Okay, so that's sort of the background of what he's doing in this book. So the treatise on eternity and time, because he talks about eternity too here, in Book 11, is part of a longer act of confession. Now we have a very general understanding of what confession is. So again, it's essentially a prayer directed to God with concrete steps conducted on the assumption that God was responding and directing to Augustine's intellectual progress. That's interesting, right? Aristotle certainly didn't do this. He didn't pray to God, as he was thinking. This is what Augustine does. He's a Christian. And Augustine designed this to be listened in on, right? We're all eavesdroppers on this, but he encouraged that by publishing it, so we're not doing anything wrong. So further, St. Augustine was an acting bishop and successor of the apostles, right? So you have to think, you get into this guy's head and try to understand how he was thinking. So for him, Book 11 and the entire Confessions, everything he published, is an apostolic act. It's an act of a bishop, and therefore an act of caritas. And for him, it expresses his apostolic. I'm not certain which apostle he would have understood himself as following from. It may have been St. Simon or St. Philip. I think they ended up down in North Africa. But for him, it expressed an apostolic love for God and neighbor, right? And expressed God's love for his human creatures, right? And he would have, he had the Bible practically memorized, and he would have been thinking about, the great commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then if you press things in this tradition, you find there's a kind of third part that's kind of implicit, and that is love your neighbor as Christ loves him, as God loves him, right? So Augustine, I think with fair confidence, we can say he was striving for that. So this treatise that we've read is an expression of his love for you. Isn't that amazing, right? Now, there was something like love in Plato too, in and Aristotle. In pagan philosophy, that's what we call it, the pagan philosophy of the pre-Christian period, and then it persists into the Christian period, right? And we studied some of that with Epicurus and Stoicism, though you seem to be stuck just with the transcript, or the manuscript rather. In pagan philosophy, we can say there's what you can call philanthropy. We call, a fellow just passed away, Mr. Feinstein, who was a great philanthropist here. And for the pagan philosophers, philanthropy can be understood as love of the human animal, right? Goodwill towards the human animal, but that means wanting to perfect people. And that means like your athletics trainer, your coach, he'll put you through the paces, right? It's not going to be it's not all going to be peaches and cream. You're going to be made very uncomfortable by some of that training. I did some martial arts. It was very, very hard training. Okay. So back up for a second here. So yeah, the Plato and Aristotle had that kind of attitude. Yeah, we want to perfect people. Now you remember the Republic and Plato's, or if you like Socrates, the fictive Socrates program for perfecting people. How rigorous was that? Okay, but about as rigorous as it gets. Okay, and with the passage to St Augustine, we move from pagan philanthropy to Christian charity. You get that? From pagan philanthropy to Christian charity. And with Christian charity, we go an extra step, and one is then oneself willing to suffer indescribable pains and even martyrdom to glorify God and to do reparation for the sins of one's neighbor and to exemplify Christian virtue and to call sinners to the, how to put this, to call sinners to the saving power of Jesus Christ. It's a different world, right? But St. Augustine understands that effectively as a perfection of Platonism. You get that? As a perfection of Platonism. Now, there is a point of context. Socrates was murdered. Isn't that interesting? And there are people in this tradition, in the later Christian tradition, who said, listen, we have to grant that somehow Socrates was a kind of proto-Christian of some sort, and we should even call him Saint Socrates. I'm not saying everybody says that, but it's interesting that some figures were thinking that way. All right? So let's turn to point C here. Augustine adds an extra confessional element to his prayer act, okay, namely a request for understanding. Okay? A request for understanding. And you might say maybe Dr. Shikiar is going too far here. Maybe if one's making a confession, implicit in that is the request to understand the nature of sin and therefore the nature of goodness, because you can't understand one without the other. They are co-implicative, right? All right, but Augustine is going beyond that. He wants understanding with respect to a particular reality and our conception of it, that is time, okay? So this is the key to understanding the whole character of the book. It is not merely the confession of a sinner, but more specifically of an ignorant sinner who is not even deserving of the wisdom for which he is asking, but asks nonetheless on the basis of faith. All right. So it is his formulation, fides quaerens intellectum. So that you might write down. That's the Augustinian motto. I think there's an Augustinian order, by the way, a group of people who they're monks and understand them. And a monk is not necessarily a priest, but most monks become priests, and they understand themselves as living this out: faith, seeking, understanding. Fides quaerens intellectum. So this is a total reversal of the Greek Advent philosophy. Do you recall that Greek philosophy, pagan philosophy, was born in mistrust? These gods, I don't trust them. You can't. And our chief authorities on the gods, for example, Hesiod, they tell us straight out you can't trust them. And if you go through Homer, you can find, Homer, not Homer Simpson, Homer, the great poet of the 8th century who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and supposedly some smaller, shorter poems called the Homeric hymns. There's plenty of material in Homer to prompt the conclusion, justify the conclusion. You can't really trust the gods. As my advisor said, the gods treated us like we're, cocks in a cockfight. They set us out there to kill one another, and kind of clapped and laughed and hooted and hollered and applauded, and each backed his own cock, right? So there you go. That, by the way, since we're putting all this in this larger historical context, that sort of depiction of the gods in Greek myth and in Homer particularly prompted a person like St. Augustine, prompted him particularly to say that these gods existed, but they were demons. Look at how they behaved. So point D here, make no mistake concerning the grandiose quality of what he is asking for. Look what he's asking for knowledge of, the relation between God, creation, eternity, and time. Well, that about sums it up, doesn't it, right? He thinks he can make an attempt at this with the assistance of God that's worthy of publication and get the whole matter done in about 20 pages. So, all right. So one might say that he proportions his humility to the greatness of the grace he is asking for, and you can imagine that is exactly how he was thinking about it. Exactly as how. You know something about St. Augustine, you find that aside from charity, there's one more virtue which for him is central, and sometimes it looks like it's even more central than charity, given how he talks, and that's humility. Okay. Oh, by the way, so guys, charity doesn't simply mean giving money away. It means it's the total and comprehensive act of self-surrender to God and love of neighbor. Okay, the whole thing. All right. So Book 11 succeeds his account of memory in Book 10, which we could have studied too, by the way, and I recommend it. And it also succeeds his confessional autobiography, books 1 through 8, and there's a treatise. Let's see, 1. He's attempting to understand how, in composing his autobiography, he has actually related. I'm sorry, to his past, right? So pastness is a big problem here. So have any of you written a memoir? You keep a diary? Well, what's the relation to what you've written in that diary, right? You occupy the present moment. And how does this present moment stand in relation to those events and experiences you recorded in your diary? And maybe some of you have written a memoir. People do that. It's a metaphysical question, right? And it's one that's highly personal. We look at it from the standpoint of autobiography. So there's your autobiography in a diary or whatever can prompt the profoundest metaphysical speculations. And since we're talking about the present and the past, we have to think now about the future as well, because that's part of the puzzle. Okay. So if you're asking about time, okay, so you're asking about the relation between past, present, and future, then you're also asking about the negation of time. The negation of time is being that's not divided into past, present, future. It's being which exists all at once, and that we call eternity. Okay? Do you get that? And we're following a logical method here, guys. We can go back to each of the slides with which we occupied the course. So something is either temporal or it is atemporal. It's one or the other. It's one or the other. It's either temporal or atemporal. And there was one omission in my slides. I'll make good on that the next time I teach this course. I didn't give you the concept of a logical complement. Okay? So you can negate a statement like God exists versus God does not exist. Now, a logical complement is not the negation of a statement, it's the negation of a concept. Okay? So you can have the concept of God, and then you can have the concept of non-God, right? So God would exist. If God exists, then he is God. He belongs, or he is referred to by the concept of God in some way. I am not a God, so I would fit into the class of non-gods, and that class of non-gods is referred to by the word non-God and by the corresponding concept. Okay, and then this relationship, by the way, between language, concepts in the domain of thought, logic, and world, the actual world out there, that fourfold. Okay, language, thought, logic and world, that is the site for a lot of philosophical speculation. Millions upon millions of pages have been published trying to figure out how those things link up to one another. It's the area that today we call, you publish in that area, you're called an expert in epistemology and metaphysics. We kind of lump those two things together. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. We'll get to that later. So let's keep these oppositions in mind. There's creator and creature versus eternity and time, okay? And finally, being and becoming. So eternity corresponds with what we call being, and time corresponds with what we call becoming. So this distinction between being and becoming, well, we get that from Plato, right? And is implicit in Aristotle. He's basically working with the same opposition. So in the Hellenic distinction, now look what's happened. The Hellenic distinction between being and becoming has been identified with these two other distinctions. Being is eternity, and eternity is the creator. Get that? The eternity is the creator. If you get into the theology, if you go to live with the creator, you live in him in eternity. Okay, that's what heaven is. You live in him, in his very being. Things get rather complicated, guys. Every time I say something, I think of a qualification. So you're living in him right now, if this metaphysics is true. But you're not living in him in the mode of eternity. You're living in him in the mode of time or becoming. You get that? But to live in him perfectly as you can, will be to live in him in the mode of eternity. Okay, leave it at that. So becoming, what's that? That's the realm in which we live, in which things change, in which we experience time. That becomes identified with time, and if you like, with creature, because the entire temporal order is the creature of God, so to speak, right? Okay, and again, you can get to fine distinctions and add many qualifications, but this is an introductory lecture, and I can't talk for 3 hours, so let's keep going. So G. So the Hellenic distinction between being, I already did that. So these identifications establishes the basic continuity between Hellenic and medieval philosophy, because Augustine is right there at the end of antiquity, ushering in the medieval period. Okay. And when does the medieval period begin? Well, there's no agreement on that, but there's a kind of symbolic date, 476. That's when Augustulus Romulus, named after both the first emperor and the first Roman, really, Romulus, was deposed. He was actually an ethnic and natural-born Roman, person of Roman blood. He was deposed, and that was the end. And never again would there be another Roman emperor, not in the West at least. And he was succeeded by a series of barbarians. Now, the complications that the barbarians themselves come to imbibe Roman customs and traditions and try to uphold them, right? So when does the Roman Empire end? It just kind of gradually peters out. If you look at it from the standpoint of tradition, it kind of gradually peters out, and who knows, So there's also now a very sharp distinction between a creationist and a non-creationist metaphysics. All right, so I'm teaching you guys introduction to philosophy, right? So when you look at Plato and his successor Plotinus, Plotinus. I'm holding the microphone here, so yeah, I'm not going to type that in. Plotinus. So you can type that into I don't like to use Google because they steer people. There's a lot of money at play in Google, and they're always steering people to websites that pay for people to pay for Google to put them up front. So I skip them. I go straight to Yandex, Yandex, who are a little bit easier to deal with. Yes, they're Russian, and you say, oh, you're pro-Russian or something. No, it's just I find I get more accurate information from them. If ever they change, it probably will sooner or later. I'll look for another one. Anyway, so what was I going to say? So we have Plotinus is described not as a creationist, but as putting forward an emanation doctrine. So for him, what the first principle of being is what he calls the one, and that emanates the intellect, and the intellect emanates the world soul. And one way or another, matter enters in. This whole Platonic tradition has a very difficult time dealing with matter. They don't understand. They have a hard time explaining where it comes from. Okay, and they tend to associate matter with disorder and recalcitrance, recalcitrance to reason and order. All right, very good. That's not the case with the Christian doctrine. Matter is good, created by God. Um, Incidentally, I might as well mention human sexuality is good and created by God. You might have a false impression about that, but that in fact is part of the doctrine. What's bad is the misuse of human sexuality. That's bad. But your hands are good too. You can use those to kill someone. I think there are as many people killed with fists every year as there are by guns. And all these good things, any good thing can be misused. Okay, so from the Christian point of view, matter is good. Okay, it's good. From the Platonic point of view, generally speaking, is bad. Generally speaking, is bad. It's kind of prison that you're caught in. You want to get out of the prison and go dwell in the realm of the ideas. Right. This is the popular tale. And in the Christian account, yeah, you want to get out of the how to put it, the what they call the passible body, the body that can suffer, and go dwell with God. But because matter is good, He's going to give you a new body, and they call it the resurrection of the body. That's going to happen later. That's just pure theology. So yeah, oppose creation with to emanation, and sometimes they call it radiation or irradiation, like the sun irradiates light and heat. So this also, understanding these distinctions here, this proposes a schema of conceptual progress. So Augustine would understand, the transition from just working with the being becoming distinction to identifying being with the creator and becoming with creature, right? Not to mention eternity and time. That for him amounts to conceptual progress. And then, there's a pretty vigorous community of scholars historically who then say, yeah, that's right. We can justify it with arguments. Either you can, you can't. And then we'll be getting to St. Thomas Aquinas, which we'll do tomorrow. You'll see another individual who tries to nail this down and make it virtually impossible to go backwards with respect to this particular point. Okay, it's also a sign of the cultural synthesis of Greek metaphysics and the ultimate fruits of Israelite and Jewish messianic history. I say Israelite and Jewish. I think I mentioned this before because the Israelites included 10 tribes which were taken into captivity, and we haven't heard from them again, though genetic tests show that they live in Illinois and other places, right? And Jewish, it has to do with if you missed this point in a previous lecture, with the province of Judea, which was so designated by the Persians under Cyrus, who liberated the Jews from the Babylonians and allowed them to go back to Canaan, ancient Canaan. And then they named it Judea because at that point they just had those two tribes, Judah and the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, and the territory had already been called Judea, I believe, under King David. And I'm getting into some contested waters here. Some people, there is a reference. We have one reference in a shard somewhere to an ancient King David. So he seems to have existed. So here we go. Jerusalem has absorbed and arguably perfected Athens. That's how someone sympathizing with Augustine might describe this. Okay. We're going to skip H. We're going to skip I. I guess we're going to skip J. I'm talking quite a lot. All right. So L, what are the realistic prospects of gaining the wisdom that Augustine seeks? God is infinite in his wisdom, right? It's unlimited. This wisdom, literally, think about it. If God knows everything, he knows every number in the natural number series. How many numbers are there in the natural number series? It's an infinite number. He knows all those simultaneously, right? You can't count those out. But God doesn't have to count things out because he's in eternity. All things are known to him simultaneously. So just by looking at the natural number series, we know his a rather trivial form of knowledge, but we know his wisdom is infinite. He knows all things. He tends to all souls from this point of view, and he's arranged everything in the entire universe for the sake of the salvation of each soul. Right? You get this? And not only your soul, but those of every soul that's ever existed. So he has a vision of billions of souls, and he's arranged everything for the salvation of each. Okay, so yeah, his wisdom is infinite. So this wisdom clearly exceeds both the capacities of human language, obviously, and the limited time of a human life. It's kind of a joke, if you think about it. But God has the power to overcome these obstacles in order to grant Augustine's prayer. So, we can rise to a measure of understanding, though we need help. So, unsurprisingly now, Augustine explicitly prays for understanding. So there are many languages, Latin, Greek, modern English, Swahili, and so on and so forth, but there's only one truth containing all truths. And I submit that for Augustine, there are at least three categories of truth. If you go through the Confessions, his other writings, I believe you can identify these three. There's the uncreated existence truth, existent truth. That's God himself, okay? And that deserves a capital T. And there's the created ideational truth. For example, concepts and propositions created in human memory as innate knowledge of created beings. So what's that? Concepts and propositions created in the human memory as innate knowledge of created being. Okay, so Augustine was one of these figures who thought that we are born with a kind of implicit knowledge. We don't possess it explicitly, right out of your mother's womb. It's there in your soul, has to be excited into actuality through experience. And you're able to, for example, to come to not really experience a tree. Bumblebees have experience of trees. Koala bears have experience of trees. But come to a conception of treeness in virtue of your possessing within your soul access to the eternal idea of the tree. And that's the true, here's where the concept of truth comes in. That's the true, as it were, paradigm or pattern of what a tree is. Sounds just like Plato, right? And Plato was the first philosopher to give us this idea of pre-existent knowledge in the soul that you're born with in his dialogue, the Meno, M-E-N-O, okay? M-E-N-O. If you find this idea compelling, you can look at the origin of the Meno. It's an excellent dialogue. Generally speaking, all the Platonic dialogues are worthy of study. So now, the third type of truth, that's linguistic truth. Truth is the property of a statement and a proposition. That, in philosophy departments, they tend to think of truth, the majority of philosophers tend to think of truth in accordance with category 3, the property of a statement. But there's still plenty of Thomists out there and a few Aristotelians who will defend 2 and implicitly 1. The Thomists defend 1, and the Aristotelians, in a way, defend 1. So here, there's not space to treat his doctrine of truth exhaustively, right? Suffice it to say that humans, unlike animals, relate to the world in a manner that is intellectually discriminatory. See, not all discrimination is bad. That word has acquired a negative connotation. It just means making distinctions. We are always separating truth from falsity, fact from fiction, reality from myth, the probable from the improbable, right? So when I say right now that Barack Obama is the current president of the United States of America, all of you immediately rebel and say, no, he's not. He used to be the president of the United States of America. Okay. So how can we recognize that some fact is part of reality? That is, that it is a genuine, true fact. I mean, how do we do that? In science, we still assign value to facts and a negative value to non-facts. So even science has some kind of value distinction at the base. They claim they don't, incidentally, but it's not true. And how do we distinguish a fact from a non-fact? Well, Augustine has an answer to this, and it's that the truth says you speak the truth. Okay, well, now you might say that's not very adequate. I don't know if that really explains things. But there's some way in which factual reality has a way of impressing it upon us so that we arrive at an apprehension, the very character of which is to declare this is true. And if that's not the case, how are you going to distinguish reality from irreality? I mean, try to worm out of that, now we have deep fakes now, and we have they've come out with Android clones. If you have $10 million, you can buy a replica of yourself, and then you can sleep in and send it to work, and so on. But it's still a real Android clone, right? And the deep fake is still a real deep fake, and there must be some way for us to know that something is a real deep fake as opposed to, if you like, a fake deep fake. Like, what if I took a video of me walking down the street, okay, and then I put it online and said, hey, check out this deep fake. That would be a fake deep fake, right? So you don't get out of the distinction between reality and irreality or non-reality by referring to deep fakes and to Android clones and things of that sort, or to the metaverse, whatever they're trying to fob on us. All things I'm trying to strictly avoid, by the way, but you can't get out of the way of it. I mean, look what I'm reduced to here. I have to do. I'd rather much infinitely prefer seeing you face to face in a room, either in Warwick or Newport or Flanagan. Is there a fourth campus, Providence? But that's not the way of the future, right? So we'll be doing it this way for a little bit. All right. So I think we talked about that. Oh, well, okay. We'll take one further step. How is it that something declares itself as true? Now, Augustine has a theory here. He thinks there's an act of divine illumination. So it's interesting. There's a kind of continuity between natural intelligence and an intelligence that's received the grace to enjoy knowledge of supernatural truths. You guys follow me? So there's this distinction between, in the whole Christian tradition, generally between nature and grace. It becomes very, very pointed and developed and worked out and systematic in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's implicit, at least in St. Augustine, and it's basically, I would argue, implicit in the New Testament. And here the idea, this is an idea which softens that distinction somewhat, as does the very fact of creation. Everything in nature is created. Therefore, it's the immediate sort of, how can I put this, sort of erupting or placing into appearance of divine love, because everything is given from that act of divine love. Can I say that again? So creation is a kind of erupting into appearance, the silent erupting into appearance of divine love through the act of creation. And when you are trying to figure out what reality is in a particular situation, okay, like how to understand my syllabus or that of one of your other professors, that's the first logical puzzle you have to solve at the beginning of the semester, right? Then you are aided in that through concrete acts of divine illumination which declare that which is reality versus that which is not, which declare the truth versus non-truth. And when I say that, I may have to add a fourth category of truth up here, right? The truth of fact. Truth of fact. Okay, so this always occurs, or almost always occurs, if it occurs, right, without our being aware of the source of illumination. So most people, most of the time, have successfully distinguished fact from not fact without being aware of the fact that it was a divine act by which they were able to do that. And that makes it, if you like, a kind of act of grace. So it's if thinking truth is good and God is responsible for all goodness, then he is responsible for one's thinking the truth. And likewise, if one's motivated to do something good, okay, then God is behind it. He has supplied one with the motivation in some way. And there's a distinction now between natural motivation and, as it were, a supernatural motivation. Natural motivation would enable one to act, let's say, in accordance with the Ten Commandments. The supernatural motivation would enable one to act in accordance with holy charity, right? See, all these distinctions are going on in the background here. Now, if there were no illumination, then there would be no truth whatsoever. Okay. At least no thinking of truth. Let's put it that way. No thinking of truth. For Augustine, can I comment on that one further degree? God is illumination itself, right? So he would think all these truths all at once, and he does all at once, right? And then he offers specific and limited acts of illumination for his human creatures and presumably angels who aren't all-knowing. So for Augustine, this is an indirect proof for the existence of God. We distinguish between truth and falsity. But if we do this, then the necessary conditions for this activity must exist. Among these necessary conditions are truth as such, it's God, its illuminative act, our receptivity to that act, and the particular truths we know through illuminative acts granted by truth as such, by God as such. But truth as such can be nothing other than God, and therefore God exists. Okay, so I kind of messed up the argument by anticipating something. So if one knows the truth, that has to be in virtue of truth as such, providing illumination. There has to be truth as such, and then particular truth. Truth in general, truth as such, um, illuminates particular truths, and so it has to exist. I mean, if we do successfully distinguish truth from falsehood and reality from non-reality, then truth as such has to exist. And if truth as such exists, then that's God, and God exists. Okay. So now we have an argument for the existence of God. So now he offers other arguments for the existence of God. That's one of the other reasons to read this treatise on time. Again, it's really a treatise on eternity and time. So let's have a look at this. Premise number one, if X is uncreated, then X contains nothing unmanifest. Okay, so what does that mean? So if X is uncreated, there's nothing in X that's unmanifest, because if it's uncreated, then it's not stretched out in time, and its existence is given, or being is given all at once in its perfection. You guys get that? So it's completely manifest, if you like, to itself. Number two, the heavens and the earth contain much that is unmanifest, right? So we can't see what's going to happen in the future. The past is not available to us except by inference. Likewise for the future, we can draw inferences concerning the future. We can't have a direct view of it, so it's all unmanifest. So, first conclusion, 3. Therefore, the heavens and the earth are not uncreated, and by parity of reason, that means they're created. Okay, so you can think about that. Argument number 2. Yeah, these sorts of arguments are still wrestled with by philosophers, and they'll pick that up, and they'll attempt to defend it as it stands, or more often refine it, because usually there are objections, and again, we can't put too much time into any one passage here. We have to keep going to get through Book 11. Argument 2, what did not pre-exist? Premise number 1, what did not pre-exist its present existence did not make itself. For example, your shoes did not make themselves because your shoes did not pre-exist the existence of your shoes. In order to bring something into existence, something has to pre-exist that which is brought into existence. Hopefully that makes sense. Number 2, heaven and earth in the present. I'm putting that in hyphens because that seems to be how he's conceiving of this. Heaven and earth in the present, okay? That's basically the whole universe. The universe in the present, or more simply, the present universe. Not the future universe, not the past universe. The present universe does not pre-exist its own existence. Therefore, heaven and earth, or the present universe, did not make itself, okay? Okay, so now you can look at it this way. You can say, one can reply that heaven and earth in the present were made by heaven and earth in the past. But the difficulty is heaven and earth in the past did not make itself either. So eventually one will have to do one of two things. You have to stop at the first moment at which heaven and earth was not preceded by another moment at which heaven and earth would have existed, right? So that would be the first moment of the existence of heaven and earth. And at that first moment, it would owe its existence to something that created it. And that would be outside of time, guys, because whatever created the first moment of heaven and earth created time. If it created time, it couldn't have been in time, otherwise time wouldn't have needed to be created, right? And that would be outside of time. It would exist all at once. If it exists all at once, it exists in virtue of itself. It exists in virtue of itself. And if it exists in virtue of itself, then existence or being is a necessary property of this thing, which necessarily exists. And there's only one being we can think of which necessarily exists, and that's God. But let's say there wasn't a first moment of time. Then we'd have to think about going on forever, and that would call out for an explanation of the whole infinite sequence, as it itself cannot explain its own being, owing to the fact that no one of its parts can cause the existence of the contemporaneous remainder. Oh, pardon me, of the non-contemporaneous remainder. That's a little slippery. Let's say that again. When you look at an infinite temporal sequence, no time phase in that sequence can cause the existence of the non-contemporaneous remainder, because there's the entire past, right? And it by itself is not the sufficient cause for the future time phases, but requires subsequent time phases which somehow cooperate with it in bringing about future, even more future time phases. Therefore, since an infinite sequence cannot explain itself either, it can only have been caused to be by something outside of it. Okay, so whether the universe has a beginning in time or it's infinite in time, there has to be something outside of it, and the universe must be a creature. Okay, that's all a little bit involved, and so I'll submit that to your attention. You might want to sit down and kind of parse that a bit and see if it works. So curiously, even if the existence of each part can be explained by reference to the preceding part, the existence of every part cannot be explained by appeal to the composition of the explanations of each individual part, for the totality of the sequence is vacant of any necessity. That's interesting. It itself requires explanation. So if we have a sequence of events, each event is dependent upon the prior event. Well, what makes the entire sequence itself, as it were, an independent existent? Well, the entire sequence is definitely not an independent existent because it itself is not a whole that exists at once. That is, the entire infinite sequence is one composed of an indefinite number of parts, an incredibly large number of parts, that is time phases, each of which sooner or later does not exist, right? And if something is composed of parts which sooner or later does not exist, then we say of the whole, it cannot possibly be that which exists in virtue of itself, and therefore it cannot possibly exist with necessity. So if it does not exist with necessity, it exists merely as a possibility. And if it exists merely as a possibility, then we have to account for the fact that this possibility has become actual in our own universe. Now, what has made this possibility actual in our own universe? Something outside of the universe. That would be the cause of the universe, and traditionally, that is what we call God. Okay, so that was I'm going to type that kind of reasoning in, but I don't have time right now. Maybe I'll type that in an email, send it to you. All right, so the Platonic Aristotelian distinction between being and becoming has in effect been specified as follows, right? We already have this. Being equals creator and God, becoming equals creature and heaven and earth. God is beautiful, good, and being without qualification, but heaven and earth are certainly beautiful. I'm sure some of you like looking at pictures of nature and of the starry heavens and of the mountains and the ocean, so on and so forth. Heaven and earth are beautiful by participation in God's beauty, but they're not beautiful insofar as, or non-beautiful insofar as they are not identical with beauty itself. Okay? So it's a qualification. So the universe is beautiful by participation, but is non-beautiful insofar as it is different from beauty itself, right? So it is not beauty of itself. The same goes for being good and being as such. All right, so these attributes later, beautiful, good, being, true, one, all those will be called transcendental, and I'll give you a lecture on those in connection with St. Thomas Aquinas. I know there's some gaps in the syllabus. I'm busy putting together a program for you guys so we can get through some of that metaphysics. After 30 years of research in philosophy, I sort of knew this before, but it's been impressed upon me even more deeply that St. Thomas Aquinas really is a kind of high point in the history of metaphysics. So in order to study this material well, it's important that one grasp his doctrines, and then you can test them out and see if his arguments work. And several other philosophers you have to study, but he's really a big one. I would say Hegel's a big one, and several others. Just look at the syllabus. Those are the ones that are particularly important. Number 5, human making impresses. That is human production. It impresses form upon matter, a shape upon leather and thread, form upon one's army divisions, virtue upon the human soul. Divine making creates form and matter at once. Okay, so we presuppose matter. We call that, in Aristotle, you call that hypothetical necessity. If you are to make something, then you must be given a certain matter upon which to work. But creation does not presuppose creation. He says, in your word, you created them, the form and the matter at once. Okay, so if God's word had occurred in time, then some bodily creature would have had to pre-exist. something wrong with the grammar here. Then some bodily creature would have pre-existed heaven and earth, right? But then that would have been matter for the act of creation. So can God's word have occurred in time? I've already said no, but we're going to follow his reasoning. If it did occur in time, there had to be some bodily creature for God to act on. That would have been the matter for the act of creation, and God would not have created form and matter at once. But this is what he did, so the divine word does not occur inside time. So in the book of Genesis, it says right there, God created heaven and earth, and then it says he hovered above the waters. So apparently there are two steps here. He creates out of nothing, and then there's this kind of sequence of acts within creation that he performs that involve hovering above the waters. That's probably a symbol of divine authority and might, and exercising his creative power over creation. The Bible, by the way, I'm not a Bible teacher, but it's highly symbolic. You have to read the symbolism to understand it. Number 8, in the beginning means in the Word. All right, this is what Augustine says. He takes that from the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of St. John. The Word is the beginning, who alone teaches and speaks to us. He abides eternally, teaching us to return to him. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit more theology here. And, the line between philosophy and theology in Augustine is not sharply drawn. I mean, there are definitely, like the arguments we looked at above, those are arguments philosophers take seriously because they don't rely upon any reference to any kind of religious dogma or any kind of sacred text. But Augustine can move very quickly back and forth between sort of philosophical argumentation and strictly theological considerations. You have to keep track of that in order to understand what he's doing. So the Word, that is the Son, strength, wisdom, and the truth of the Father. Okay, that's a strictly theological point. So I've made that point. 7 through 9 are theological points. You have to note them to understand St. Augustine. I recommend looking at The City of God, where he goes into depth here, also on the Trinity. And the remarkable thing is all the books that are actually worth reading let's see here, are available for free. Not all of them, but a lot of them are available for free online. All the classics are available for free online. And yet, what do people do? They watch action films and romances and some smut and so on and so forth. That's the nature of our species. That's why I think Plato somewhere said the human being is by nature sick. And why Jews and Christians talk about rebellion against God, or in the case of Christians, actual fallenness. So here we go. Number 10, what was God doing before he created the world? Okay, argument. What's going on here? It says God's will is his being. Okay? Because whatever occurs in God is coincident with his being. So it's identical with his being. Say it again. Whatever occurs in God, whatever is in God, any of his attributes is coincident with his being. So it's identical with his being. You guys follow? I'm giving you a lot of kind of heady metaphysics all at once. So God's will is his being. So if that's the case, then there is not one time at which he willed, another time at which he did not. God is an eternal act of will. Number 3, if there's not one time at which he willed, another at which he did not, then he did not will before the creation. So therefore, he did not will creation before creation. 5, he either willed the existence of creation in time, or else he wills it in eternity, and therefore he wills the existence of creation in eternity. And that is more or less, it's virtually, that's virtually like a dogma or something, if you talk to Christians about that. Now, there's always somebody trying to fool around with this stuff and challenge it. It's either a dogma or a quasi-dogma. So argument number 11. In eternity, all is present, but past and future, which are modes of time, exclude one another, right? And what cannot coexist with a thing cannot produce it. Okay, so you have to, if you're producing a pair of shoes, you have to work on the leather and the thread up to the point where you manage to bring it to perfection. At that point, at the last little pull of the thread, you're in contact with the shoes and coexistent with them, okay? So therefore, neither the past can produce the future, because the past is that which doesn't exist, nor the future produce the past. The future can't produce the past either. Okay, we're in brutal abstraction here, guys. But if you need to, just rewind a little bit, listen to it again, think about it. If you need to take a break, go make yourself some tea, make a smoothie, whatever it is. Come back, try to understand this stuff. It could be a distraction if you're a little bit too physically comfortable, but you don't want to be too uncomfortable either. You have to find the mean. So number 3 again, neither the past can produce the future because the past does not exist, nor the future produce the past. When you produce something, it has to be an act which is contemporaneous with that which receives the act. The agent must be contemporaneous with the patient, is how we would say this. Okay, that's in Aristotle, by the way. Therefore, only something outside of time, namely in eternity, only something outside of time, namely in eternity, is qualified to produce both. Okay, that is the past, the present, I should say the future as well, but the future, from the standpoint of eternity, the future is already completely actual. It's one of the paradoxes of the relationship between eternity and time. If this metaphysics is correct, then God is contemplating the future right now, and it's as present to him as is his present moment, as is the past. The past would be as present as well. So Caesar crossing the Rubicon, according to this theology, God himself on the crucifix is as present to him eternally. And he can't get out of this because it's a necessary implication of his very own being. That's as present as what's going on right now in this lecture. Okay. So, answer to question 10, God created nothing before he made creation. All right? Now, Augustine says he now knows this. This is truth. So now he's implicitly relying upon his earlier analysis of truth. This is the reality of the matter, he says. It's not we didn't get to this through sense perception. You can't just look out the window or put something under a microscope and see it, but you can now know on the basis of solid logic, using the method of philosophy and theology. You can now know on the basis of solid logic that this is truth. God did not create anything before he made creation, but that occurs in eternity. And so there's an eternal issuing of time, right? And of the universe. There's an eternal issuing of time in the universe. When we turn from God to the time in the universe, there's Augustine would say now, there's a first point in time, okay? And as far as the last point in time, well, he'd probably say on the basis of Scripture there's a last point as well, but that's above our pay grade here, guys, so we'll just leave that out. So if time was, then God made it. If it was not, then he did not make time, certainly, which did not exist. Now, surely time was. That has existed in the past. But what is the past? How can something that once existed no longer exist and yet be referred to? How can we refer to what does not exist? Okay, so now we're making the transition into the philosophy of time. What then is time? Now he says, before being asked, I know what it is, because we're familiar with it. And Augustine was familiar with it. We experience it, right? After being asked, I do not know. That is, Augustine knows how to use the term tempus in Latin correctly in well-constructed Latin sentences. He was a trained rhetorician, by the way, just like Thrasymachus. He used his rhetoric eventually to persuade people of what he thought to be the truth. So he can use the word, but he can't define the term. So he breaks it into its parts. The future he now defines as what is not yet, the present as what is disappearing, and the past as what is no longer. Can anything be composed of two parts that do not exist? So that begins the puzzle of time for you. Okay, so there's a future philosopher of time named Henri Bergson. Henri Bergson's scholarship suffered a major blow because he designated to the executors of his estate to burn all of his manuscripts, all of his private notes. Otherwise, he might be as studied as Husserl and these other Heidegger, these other 20th century philosophers who were famous. So, number 15, we speak of times having lengths, right? But what does not have a magnitude? The Second World War was roughly 5 years long, a little bit less, right? If you include the Pacific War, just a shade less. Okay. But how can that be? Because the Second World War unfolded over a continuum of time, and at any moment, any present moment of the Second World War, the majority of what we call the Second World War did not exist, right? Both the past and future. And at the very last moment of the Second World War, when they signed the armistice agreements, I believe in Tokyo, maybe it was in the Philippines, I can't remember. The entire past of it didn't exist. Yet we say it was about 5 years long. Okay, folks, what do we do about this? The past doesn't exist, yet we measure it. How can it have a length? Excellent. He says a particular time was long while it was present, because insofar as it was present, it was long. Okay, so we can measure, and they did measure the Second World War as it was passing through the present. So can we measure a passing? All right, maybe we're making some progress here. We'll find out. But in fact, no length of time can be present. No length of time can be present, as any magnitude of time may be divided into a part that is past, and a part that is present, and a part that is future, and so on, until the present shrinks to an extensionless point, right? Should I illustrate that? Here, why don't I'll illustrate that for you right now. So you can imagine a time continuum, or a certain magnitude of time. That's the way to put it. A certain magnitude of time having that length. But you can always cut that in half, right? What happened there? I ended up with the wrong type of figure. Let's go back. Here we go. Let's cut that in half. That's about half right there. But that time magnitude could also be cut in half, right? And that one can be cut in half, right? And that one, what happened there? I got an extra. Oh, the program is giving me this big fat line for some reason. Let me just do this. There we go. And that one can be cut in half, right? Whoopsie daisy. And that one can be cut in half. Okay? And then that one can be cut in half. You guys get it? We keep going forever. And that says, with the technology I'm dealing with here, and we're about to hit the threshold of the minimum threshold of perception, you just keep dividing that. So go back to what he said. There is no length of time that can be present, because you can always divide the magnitude down to an extensionless point. Okay? So we come back to this thought. Perhaps time may be measured while it's passing in its passage. Okay? Even through the extensionless point. He proposes this as a hypothesis, not as a conclusion. So what we need is an argument that would justify this conclusion. So you see, in philosophy, there are hypotheses too. It's just that we can't use telescopes and microscopes and the instruments of science to evaluate our hypotheses. We have to use pure logic. Okay, so what's happened here? This thing is not okay. There we go. So here we go. At this point, he says he's seeking and not praying. That's interesting. I don't know why he says that, to be perfectly frank. I thought the entire thing was being done in the mode of prayer. So I'd have to think about that some more. So either the present alone exists, or past, present, and future all exist, in fact, despite what he's reasoned out so far, but the past and future in some peculiar and hidden way. So, I should have commas here, right? So there are now two ways forward in the investigation. Either analyze the present in such a way as to show how it can permit of our intending what seem to be non-existent future and past times. Now, what does intending mean? How we can think about them. Analyze the present in such a way that can permit of our intending with our consciousness, right? These are acts of attention, what seem to be non-existent future and past times. Or go the other direction, explain the peculiar way in which future and past times exist. Augustine's going to take the first branch of those two alternatives. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Henri Bergson takes the second. He says, no, the past and the future do exist. And then he tries to explain how that's the case. So 18. but he has not arrived at the first path just yet. If future and past are, then they are in the present. Memory is an impression presently entertained. Memory is an impression presently entered. So you have a memory of what you had for breakfast yesterday. Think about that. You have an impression in your soul of the experience you had yesterday, and then you can sum it up and entertain that impression right now. So prediction and planning are by nature, are by present conceptions, right? He adds. So let's say you make a prediction and you plan for the future. So you predict that tomorrow the sun will come up. And you do that in virtue of your experience of the sun coming up in the past. You're imagining it right now, okay? You're imagining it right now if you're listening to me. And in virtue of that present impression of your past experience of the sun rising, you are now predicting it will rise tomorrow. You're also making a plan for the weekend. What are you guys going to do this weekend? You're going to go to the YMCA for a swim or to work out. You're going to go down to Narragansett to walk on the beach, right? You're going to go out to Pacha to walk in the woods, whatever it may be. You say, why am I going to bother doing that? I'm right here, so I'm going to go to the trails on the east side, right off of Blackstone. Okay, so and so on. But you're making those plans in virtue of present imaginings. Okay, whether you're imagining Narragansett or Chepachet or the east side of Providence, whatever it may be. Excellent. You're saying I'm not doing any of those things. I'm going to clean my house. Very good. But you're imagining your house right now. So you see what I'm saying? All right. Then he gives us a little note on prophecy. These are images entertained in the present based on knowledge of present causes, but assisted by revelations. So clearly, St. Augustine, a bishop, believes that prophecies are real. And there's evidence that prophecies are real because there's more or less universal testimony amongst the persons who knew him that the person we call Jesus did predict that he would be killed and then raised up in 3 days. And then all of them went on. All the persons who were his followers eventually sort of came back and said, my goodness, he's actually come back to life. So now we're going to go out and do what he told us to do and tell people that despite their consciousness of sin, their sin debt has been paid and the doors of heaven have been flung open. And if they can cooperate with the program, like do 10 Commandments and participate in the sacraments of the church and all that, then they can go to heaven and live with God, which is pretty good, right? And we're going to do this even though our master was murdered, and we don't care if we get murdered. We're just going to keep doing it. So it's hard to understand that motivation unless all those people who did that, and there was a lot of people, the 11 plus Matthias, the 12 apostles, plus Paul, right, plus a bunch of disciples. It's hard to explain how they would have, what would have motivated them to go out there and spread that teaching, knowing that they were risking their lives and they were probably, better than even odds going to suffer a violent death unless they actually believed that they encountered Christ risen, right? That's one of the standard arguments for Christianity. So now you know it. So number 20, time is really 3 modes of the present. Okay, now this is where we're getting genuine Augustinianism here. The present of things past, the present of things present, and the present of things future. And that's based upon our thought experiment about thinking about the past on the basis of a present impression and thinking about the future through prediction, through planning, or through the consideration of prophecy or actually making a prophecy. All right. All based on present impressions. How about measurement? We get back to that very interesting question, which I'm interested in, the measurement of time. What is measured passes from what does not yet exist through the extensionless into what is no longer. Best of luck understanding that, but that seems to be what we actually experience. So one can complain about it and say, I don't understand this, but the truth itself seems to be telling us that this is true, right? I mean, we do measure time, and it seems to come from what does not yet exist. It passes through the extensionless present, and from the extensionless present, it passes into the non-being of the past. All right, that's very good. Now you say, well, we can't yet say that the that the truth itself is telling us that that's true, because there's Henri Bergson, who has a different account of the matter. By the way, Henri Bergson taught that the present is not even a point. It has expansion. You can't experience anything unless you inhabit an expanded present. It seems to have some kind of truth to it, but maybe in a future version of this course, I'll teach some Bergson. So he prays and emphasizes the distinction between speaking and understanding what is said. Speaking, understanding. That was the departure point for this whole discussion. This applies directly to speech about God and speech to God, but as it turns out, to a sizable portion of creation as well. All of creation exists in time. So if time cannot be understood, nothing in creation can, because everything in creation bears the mark of temporality as a kind of essential ingredient. And if you can't understand this essential ingredient, you can't even understand creatures. I mean, God's tough enough. One can focus just on creatures and not make any headway either. Make a little bit of headway, but you can't get to the goal. Let's find out. So now, some have claimed that time is an implication of the motions of the heavenly bodies. Some have said, okay, well, listen, let's try to ground this in observed reality. Time does not exist in and of itself. It exists in virtue of the motion of the heavenly bodies. Okay, so now imagine the heavenly bodies just stopping in the heavens. Well, would you continue experiencing time? Yeah, you'd be staring up at the heavenly bodies when scratching your head saying, why'd they stop? And you would be doing that for some period of time. So that doesn't work. Others have stated that it is a property of motion. The time is a property of motion. That's Aristotle's theory. But if things stopped moving and then resumed, they would have remained frozen for a definite duration, which would presuppose the continued existence of time. So that's his attempt at refuting Aristotle's definition of time. And there's a major reversal here. You know, for Aristotle, what's basic is motion, right? Augustine says, no, that's wrong. You can't understand time as a parasite of motion, or something that exists only insofar as there's motion, or what we call change. Time, in fact, is the most basic and universal of all God's cosmic creatures, and every other cosmic creature conforms to it. Now, presumably angels do not, but they're not cosmic creatures. They reside in heaven. And there might be some kind of quasi-time in heaven, but we don't know. So I can't say anything about it. So he makes a confession, and then we'll keep going. We measure the longer by the shorter unit. Okay? The word is measured by the syllable, correct? So take the word syllable. So we have syllable. And we measure syllable by the composition of its syllables. Syllable. Syll plus plus bull, each of those has a length, produce syllable. But what is the natural unit for the measurement of time? And then there is no answer. In any event, one thing is probable: time is a kind of extendedness. Okay, here's his answer. It's probably an extendedness of the mind itself. He is in the area of probability, not understanding. This is still a hypothesis. So we measure the duration of a tone or speech as it passes, not when it is yet to come. Once it is past, we say that we have measured it. What do we measure when we measure? We can't measure time past, as it does not exist to be measured. Not time future for the same reason. We can't measure time present because it's extensionless, nor an indefinite continuity without beginning or end, for limits are required in order to assign a measure. And yet we measure time. Okay. So I do not measure what no longer exists when comparing a long syllable to one half its length, but something that remains engraved in my memory. So what is it that's engraved in one's memory that one can measure? So maybe we're kind of fighting our way into a hidden recess of the human mind where is stored, right, in the memory, right, these different measurable impressions, these magnitudes, and it's in virtue of some sort of peculiar operation in there that we're able to make these measurements. So it is in the mind that I measure. What I measure is the impress made in my mind by the things as they pass and abiding in you as they pass. Do we measure silence? Sorry. There we go. Do we measure silence through stretching the mind to measure the phrase as though it were actually sounded? One's attention, which is present, causes the future to make its way into the past. The future diminishing and the past growing. So this is like an attention-based theory of time. Say it again. One's attention, your attention is always present, okay? So let's try to understand time relative to present attention. Your present attention causes the future to make its way into the past, the future diminishing and the past growing, until the future is exhausted and everything is past. He has concluded that it is through acts of attention upon A, impressions made upon the mind by things, or B, auto-generated images stretched from the future through the present, disappearing into the past, that we experience and measure time, right? There are two possibilities here. Either something's impressing itself on your mind, and you're attending to what impresses itself on your mind, or you're generating these impressions yourself, okay? Either way, it's all passing through your present attention. But how can the future diminish and the past augment? If something's passing through your present moment of attention, the future is getting shorter, right? Assuming the universe will come to an end, I guess. And the past would be getting larger one way or another. So the answer is that in the present, the mind attends to in three different ways, two of which are subject to continuously varying magnitude. A, the mind expects by representing what is present as if it were future and continuously assigns it a diminishing magnitude as it is represented as passing through the present. B, the mind attends to the present, which has no magnitude but is represented as that through which the future passes. Okay. C, the mind remembers what it takes to have passed through the present in such a way as to take it as continuously augmenting in magnitude. Okay, so this stuff needs commentary, but I can't do this. I can't put too much more time into this. And yet one's present active attention itself seems to endure for a certain magnitude. This should be impossible if that act in its purity is focused on the present. Now, perhaps the answer is that somehow we could focus on just the present and stop anticipating the future and remembering the past. Indeed, we would escape time altogether, at least as a mode of experience, and enter into an immeasurable modality of consciousness. Well, isn't that what it would be like to be in heaven? You just focused on the eternal now, of the eternal being of God. Anyway, if there is anything being measured on the theory arrived upon so far, that would have to be the representations of the future passing through the present into the past. Present attention can only be measured by dividing up its aspects this way, and there is no way of measuring one simple act of attending to the present moment. This would involve measuring the infinitesimal contradiction. So Augustine concludes that his inquiry has not yet succeeded in yielding certain knowledge of time. He has merely magnified the mystery of creation and the sense of weakness of the human mind. The only thing left for Augustine is to throw oneself upon the mercy of God, typo there, in longing for his love and for union with him beyond time. He concludes his reasoning with prayer and worship. That's how he began it. Okay, guys, that's where we're going to stop. Hope that you found it stimulating, and hope you are nourished by that, and you continue to think about the problem of eternity and time. Okay, be well.